Welcome to Rays of Hope, a podcast of Hope and Truth Ministries. In today's episode, we're joined by Karl KJ Johnson, and we're going to be discussing the question, is America still the land of the free? Join us and listen in. KJ, welcome to Rays of Hope here on Hope and Truth's podcast, and I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Good evening to where you are, and good morning where I'm at. It's interesting how we can connect on different corners of the globe in this time of lockdown.
Absolutely. Just in case you're wondering where I am, I'm in Hyderabad, India, and KJ is all the way across the globe in Chicago. So we're very thankful for the means to be able to record this. Today, we're going to be discussing the question, is America still the land of the free? Is America still the land of the free, even as you gear up for your July 4th celebrations? I think it's a question that is on the forefront of a few people's minds, maybe not everybody. And as I was thinking about recording this, I thought there's nobody better to record this with than KJ, and I'll tell you why. Actually, I'll let him tell you why, but KJ brings a lot to the table in the context of this discussion. He is a Marine. I don't want to say a former Marine because I was once chastised by somebody and who said to me, once a Marine, always a Marine. Is that true, KJ?
It is. I hope that wasn't me. I try to be charitable on that, but yes, your status as a Marine might shift from active duty to retired, but once a Marine, always a Marine.
Once a Marine, always a Marine. No, it wasn't you. It was somebody else who chastised me, and so I learned my lesson. And so KJ,
you learned well. Good job.
Thank you. KJ is a Marine, and apart from his experience in serving the nation of the United States, he also has quite some significant experience as an apologist. He works for RZIM and also for CSLI. Well, do you want to tell us a little bit, KJ, about your experience as a Marine, and then maybe what you're doing now with RZIM and the C.S. Lewis Institute?
Yeah, up front, let me make it clear. I'm not an apologist with RZIM. I work on staff as senior advisor to the global CEO. I used to be the director of operations for U.S. Ministries and help run that stuff. And I can get more into that. I am the director for the C.S. Lewis Institute in Chicago, and I've done all of that in my post-Marine career. I am a retired Marine. I spent 20 years on active duty. I was in the United States as United States Marine Corps as an officer from 1992 to 2012. 9/11 was pretty much right in the middle of my 20-year career. So I went in right out of college, took a commission, was offered an air contract so that I could fly. I ended up becoming a helicopter pilot and deployed all over. Most of my time was in Asia, two different tours in Okinawa, Japan, which afforded me the ability to get all over the Pacific Rim and a little bit further into Asia, which was wonderful. But I've also deployed out to the Middle East as well. As is prone to do in any organization, as you get promoted up in spend time, you don't get to do the fun stuff as much anymore. So I also became sort of a weapons and tactics officer and a strategy kind of guy, and worked at a higher level headquarters on strategy and things like that as well. So it wasn't just flying helicopters. So I helped build operational plans and things like that. Or various scenarios and stuff.
When and how did the turn in the road come? How did you decide to join the Christian ministry? How is it that you ended up working for RZIM and CSLI? Just very briefly, as far as that goes.
Well, my life has always been one of kind of crazy left-hand turns. I was an English major in college with this plan on going into journalism. And when I was offered the air contract, a lot of people said, I don't understand how you get an English major to be a helicopter pilot. And so I just did the same sort of thing. I decided I wanted to study theology. Well, I actually wanted to study philosophy first. I was really falling in love with apologetics, but I wanted to go deeper than just popular level apologetics. I wanted to get deeper into thought,
Yes.
things like that. And it was primarily through a couple things. It was my involvement with, it was my discovery of Ravi Zacharias. Found him on the radio one night and started taking in everything he was writing and speaking about, and got to know the folks in his ministry, and they were great, and they became great, wonderful friends. I also got involved with the C.S. Lewis Institute when I was stationed in Washington, D.C., participated in their discipleship program called the C.S. Lewis Fellows Program, and that is what I thought really captured my heart, and I knew I wanted to go into ministry. I didn't know what exactly I was going to do, and I didn't think it would be with either of those organizations, really. But I went to seminary, hit back here in Chicago to study philosophy, and then there I fell in love with theology. And so I did a master's in philosophy and then a master's in theology as well. So,
yeah.
And then me too. That's right here.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. There are more moving parts, but that's the simplified version.
Yes, the nutshell version. I appreciate that, and I really do think that with your perspective as a Marine and somebody who's now working for two apologetics organizations, RZIM and CSLI, two big names in apologetics. Even though you're not an official apologist, you still think apologetically.
Yes. Yes.
And, so I think you bring a very unique perspective to this whole discussion of freedom. And so as we're going to discuss this question, is America still the land of the free? KJ and I, just for your information, our viewers, we've sort of agreed to disagree to sort of balance the scales in our discussion. And I think that's healthy, coming at it from two different perspectives. And so when we talk about freedom, I think it's very important for us to know what we mean by freedom. What is freedom? How do we define freedom? What are the parameters of freedom? So I want us to begin with that, KJ. When you think of freedom, what comes to your mind? What do you mean by freedom when you think of freedom?
Well, freedom is another word for nothing left to lose, right? No, I'm joking. That's the old 60s song.
Yes.
Janis Joplin. No, I actually don't believe that. We could go into, since we're both, have some theological education, even as we're talking about sort of on the pre-show stuff, we could really geek out and get into try to get into a really theological, philosophical definition of it. But that's not a practical day-to-day use. Sometimes it's good to have that understanding. But I think for most people listening, I would like to characterize freedom as the ability to self-determine or to have self-control. And I think that is at the heart of what freedom in the United States is, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It gives you the ability and self-determine can be unpacked, and someone could push back on that as well, but to make your own decisions and not to have them foisted necessarily upon you. So that would be, I think, a good layman's starting point on what freedom is, the ability to have self-control. So if I decide that I want to go to school or I don't want to go to school, I want to work here or I don't want to work here, I want to marry this person and I don't want to marry this person, that those are afforded to me as a basic right. That's where I would want to start. We could unpack that more. But, I mean, does that jive with the way you've got a unique perspective coming from where you are. I mean, I purposely use the idea of marriage in there because I've got a number of friends from your homeland who live here now and they're citizens, but they have gone back to India for an arranged marriage. So you've got and that's just one, low-hanging fruit example. You've got a very different perspective. How would you have defined freedom before your time in the U.S. and then after? I'd be interested in your perspective.
I think it's very interesting. You look at it from an Eastern perspective, and the whole idea of that you have a right. You have to ask the question, is it a human right or is it a national right? Are all humans born free in a political democratic sense, or is it just a national right? Because here there are some schools of thought which would say that not all humans are free. And a la the caste system in India, there are some humans who are freer than other humans. And there are some humans which are born with much more privilege than other human beings. And so when you talk about freedom as a right, my immediate response is it a human right or is it a national right? Clearly, in the case of the United States, it would seem to me that it's both. It's both a human right and a national right. And the human right is defined by the national right. Whereas if you come to a nation like India, or even let's take the Middle East, for example, where you were posted a few times, there it's not necessarily a human right. You have so many laws in countries where Sharia law is imposed. They're not free in the sense of in how we would use the word free. Slightly different there.
Yeah, I think the only thing I might tweak on that, what you said, is here in the United States, I'd say the national right is based on the human right, not the other way around, because, and we can get into this later, I know this is the direction you want to go, but understanding the intent of the founding fathers, I don't think they would want rights to be something that the government gives, because if the government is giving these rights, they can take them away. And their intent was that these were inherent, inalienable rights, and that even these things are grounded in perhaps human dignity, grounded in the image of God. That's something that the government cannot take away. Now they could try to restrict them, but that would be a tyrannical move on their part. So that would be the only thing I would say, because we don't base it the other way. The government doesn't give us those rights. It is recognizing those rights.
Yes. I'm really glad you tweaked that, because I want to get. Yeah, absolutely it does. I'm very happy that you tweaked that and you fine-tuned it, because I want to get a little bit more into the intent of the founding fathers in just a bit here. But if you look at what's happening right now in America, very interesting. There's been a confluence of several different events. And this is, of course, an election year. That's a different topic, which we won't get into. But it just seems that 2020 has been a very, very, very interesting year so far. You've had COVID, and then you have all of these cultural. I don't want to call it cultural wars, but there's definitely cultural tension right now as you look at the United States. And so, heading into the 4th of July weekend, I'm not very sure, and I'm using the word here, seems. That's the operative word here. I really have to ask the question, is America still the land of the free? You listen to the Star-Spangled Banner, and there's that verse that says it's the land of the free and the home of the brave. Certainly still the home of the brave, but I really want to get at the question, with all that's going on right now. I mean, you think of how certain mayors are, what some would say is that they're abusing their power, certain gubernatorial abuses of power during the COVID crisis. You look at the protests, the marches, the riots, and I like to distinguish all of them. Protests are different from riots and different from marches. They're, in the wake of George Floyd's death. And so with all of that that's going on, and you have so many different political views, you've got, one extreme, the other extreme, and so many people in between. So the question I want to ask you is America still really free? And I'm not saying it from the perspective, oh, America is done. No, I'm just asking a genuine question, as I like to put it, an Eastern millennial who has lived for almost more than one third of my life in the US.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I know that in times of turmoil, and I don't think you would be overstating it to have used the word culture wars, because I think that, war takes many forms. Even in literal warfare, it takes different forms. We have psychological warfare, and we have information operations that we will, engage, and that happens daily now because we live in a digital era. And so you hear about hackings from other countries or things like that. So I don't think it'd be an inappropriate use of the war. There is a lot going on, and I understand the concern, and I think we need to be vigilant. But in one sense, I think we may be reaping the fact that we have too much freedom, and that sounds strange to say, but I don't know that to say that to ask if we are still the land of the free would imply perhaps that there are some freedoms that have been taken away. Now,
Okay.
I wouldn't put back on the fact that there may be some intrusion or impingement upon some freedoms, and we need to stand up when someone abuses freedom. But I don't, we still have our amendments. We still have the Bill of Rights. We still have the right to free speech, even if at sometimes violated in certain points. The one that would concern me the most would be some religious liberties that certainly have been challenged. But we're getting to a point where I think we have so much freedom. We got freedoms that are in conflict. So let's just take the fact that there has been some watershed decisions made by the Supreme Court regarding marriage.
Yes.
You can now have same-sex marriage. That is a freedom. As a matter of fact, in this one sense, that's an increase in freedom in the United States. Okay? Where there was no freedom there, now that there's freedom. But now, say you have Islamic organization that does not, isn't on the same page as same-sex marriage.
I was going to go there, but I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Exactly. And so let's just say there's an Islamic community outside Detroit that has a food shelter or does work in the community or something like that. Should they be forced to hire someone like that, of a homosexual persuasion? Now you've got these freedoms that are in conflict. That's a high level one. We could get into something more simple. You can get into the baker making a cake, or even something as those nuns who were asked to provide certain kinds of health care. So we've got freedoms that are in conflict in one sense. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
It does, and I really like the way you phrased it. Freedoms, plural, in conflict. I think that would, be a good description of what we're seeing right now. But as far as the intent of the framers of the Constitution and also, the Declaration of Independence, it would seem like, and again, the operative word here is seem, it would seem like we're moving or drifting away from what the intent of the Constitution and the intent of the Declaration of Independence was. Because, if you think about the Declaration of Independence, if you've read it, it's majestic in its language. It sets a vision, a grand vision. And then you look at the Constitution, what that does is that the genius of the Constitution is that it executes what the Declaration of Independence sees. And it seems like you have one group of people over here who love the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they want to shun the Constitution because of the fact that it's too rigid, and that, they fail to see that there's a balance between the Declaration and the Constitution. That being the case, it seems to me like we're moving away, we're drifting away from the founders' intent there. Any comments?
Yes, I think you're right. I think what we need are some good civics classes to try to get into the minds and the hearts of the founding fathers a little better, to understand what it was they were trying to do. They, while not perfect, and no one's perfect, and we're living in an era right now where a lot of these shortfalls in the men and women of our history are being highlighted. I don't want to overlook that, but I don't want to be overly anachronistic in the moment either. And I do want to point out that there was a genius to this great American experiment. And I know you and I are both lovers of appreciators of the work of Os Guinness, and he's pointed this out. He's got his golden triangle freedom, and I think you're right in the idea to say that we're drifting. But the founding fathers talked about only a virtuous people could be ruled in this kind of freedom. And Oz points out that that in order to have this freedom, he talks about this golden triangle freedom. Where liberty requires virtue. Virtue requires religion. Religion requires freedom. So he actually pins, you got the canary in the coal mine model. He uses religious freedom as a benchmark for how free our country is. And so that's where I would say, if we're becoming less free, I'm worried about the impingement that's coming about in our religious freedoms, because that will trickle down in everywhere else. But so we're drifting in our understanding of what freedom is.
Mm-hmm.
We're drifting in our own sense of virtues,
Mm-hmm.
because right now it's really become don't tread on me, and don't, freedom is you can't tell me what to do. We're all becoming extreme libertarians in a sense. And and I use the word extreme there on purpose, not to take shots at libertarians in general, but sort of like we're becoming solipsistic, all very self-referential, and you can't tell me what to do.
Right.
And one of the elements, and that's why I said we can unpack it. One of the elements of freedom, it's not just a freedom from, but I think the founding fathers would want to make the claim that there's responsibilities and obligations that go along with freedom. So there's also a freedom for.
Freedom for, yes.
And I don't think we've got that as much. We've just got people going, I can do whatever I want to do, and you cannot tread on that at all.
Right, right. So if I hear you correctly, what you're saying, back to Os Guinness's golden triangle. So you've got the freedom, which is based on the virtue, but where do you get the virtue from? The virtue has to come from faith. So you have these three constantly working together: freedom, faith, or freedom, virtue, and faith. So what I hear you saying is that the virtue is being corrupted because the faith, or the religious aspect, in God we trust, is eroded. Is that what your point was?
Yeah, I think that would be a simplified view. I think there's a lot to it. I think there is an erosion, or there's an impingement upon our religious liberties, but I also think that secularism, and he goes on to build on Richard Niebuhr's idea of these public squares, and this might be a topic for another discussion, but the naked public square, the sacred public square, and the civil public square. And we come from a background where America has largely been Protestant Christian. There were a lot of other faiths from the get-go, but the overriding predominant public view was Protestant Christianity. And so we have largely been in a sacred public square for a long time, where that was the voice of the culture. And even when we were going to elect, when we elected JFK, it was a big deal because he was Catholic.
Yeah.
The same
I was not around then, but I hear you.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't either. I was just slightly before my time. But just like people were vexing on whether or not they could vote for Mitt Romney because he was a Mormon, they were wringing their hands in the same way for JFK because of his Catholicism. Well, Oz makes the point that there's been a struggle, and they're trying. There's this idea to have a naked public square where we're stripping down any religious or worldview content to try to make it neutral, which we know there's no neutral point.
No.
He argues for a civil public square, and that bristles against our own notions of freedom, because those of us who want to say that America is a Christian nation, sure, there's a lot of that in its underpinnings, but part of it is where are we now? And actually, America, in one sense, is more free than I think some people want to realize, because Oz talks about what's our statement on the seals: "E pluribus unum." Pluralism was built into the DNA of this country. I think that's almost an exact quote. I'm paraphrasing slightly, and that means everybody gets a seat at the table. And so we have to wrestle with this. And sometimes, in order to strengthen our own freedoms, that means we have to support the freedoms of others, even those with whom we disagree. So if I feel like if you are putting out something that is hurtful or hateful, I got to support your right for free speech, because that could come back and bite me later if I try to muzzle you.
Yeah. I think the issue is there, though, are we tolerant of intolerance? What I mean by that is there are certain worldviews that are just intolerant of differing worldviews. And so when you invite to the table, to use your analogy, people who do not, they don't have the capacity to agree with, they don't have the capacity to tolerate a differing worldview, that's where we get into problems. And I think what we're seeing in the wider culture is that there are so many polarized views. We've forgotten how to be civil. And especially if you come from a worldview that says, no, you can't tolerate at all what the other person is saying, because to do so would be to go against who you are, to go against conscience.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Ravi Zacharias, in his book Light in the Shadow of Jihad, addresses some of this really nicely. And I think he points out that if you're going, and he's not being as explicit in this public square analogy as Oz was, but it applies directly that everybody gets a seat at the table, but not in a way to undermine or underpin the original architecture that gives you the very freedom you now have to speak out.
Yeah.
So if you have a worldview that comes to the table and their purpose is to undermine the very freedoms that give them the freedom to say it, then that is supposed that one, it's okay. So I think there are ground rules. There are rules of engagement in this great American freedom. So that goes back to freedom, and we can talk about constraints on freedom.
Yes.
We are not free. I am free to, okay, this is going to sound crass, especially as a Christian, but if I'm a single man in America, technically and legally, I'm free to sleep with whomever I want. It's not a good idea for me to sleep with my friend's wife. That would be very bad. There are certain constraints. If I want to maintain my friendship with that person, I really ought to think twice. Now, again, that's a crass but very clear example. You can distill that much more subtle, nuanced levels of, so many people go, well, it's my right. Let's talk about the COVID-19 lockdown right now. It's, hey, I don't want to wear a mask, but if we're going to love our neighbors, sometimes that means a sacrifice or a suppression or just a temporary setting aside of some of our rights. Now, of course, we can unpack that because I know there's a lot more to those issues, and that's a bit simplistic. So anyhow, there are constraints on freedom, and I think we need to.
Yes, there are boundaries, there are parameters to freedom. And I think since you and I have mentioned Os Guinness quite a few times now, I think it's worth showing our viewers, our listeners, this book by Os Guinness called The Last Call to Liberty. It is a book that I would highly recommend to anybody who wants to understand freedom in the context of our culture today. Os Guinness brings out many brilliant points. And there's another book that I would like to suggest, which I don't have with me right now, but it's called The Founder's Key. The Founder's Key by Larry Arnn. I think both of these books have been a real education and an inspiration for me. But one of the things I loved in Oz's book, besides the golden triangle of freedom that KJ mentioned, is his framework that he brings out, his 7-faceted framework of what freedom is or of what constitutes freedom. And I just want us to briefly touch on each of these things, because I really think if you talk about parameters, if you talk about boundaries here, constraints, if you will, this is really a very comprehensive definition for all of us to understand what constitutes freedom. First of all, he talks about freedom as being a matter of the will, And do we really desire it? Do we will it? Would you say, KJ, that people in our culture today in the United States still have the desire, the innate desire to be free, or have some of them just thrown in the towel and have said, whatever, just doesn't matter anymore? Or are we still fighting for it? Is the will still there?
Yeah, I think the will is there, but it's uneven. And I think it goes back to our understanding of what freedom is and those responsibilities and obligations. And I think what we need is a bit of re-education in the sense of what freedom is. Because there's a lot of will out there. As you can see, you're talking about a lot of the manifestations of the turmoil, whether it's a peaceful protest or the non-peaceful rioting and looting. And let's get away from the looting that is just people for a moment. Let's get away from the looting that's just exploitation and people smashing and grabbing. There is some more violent forms of protest, but they are trying to make a point. And but to me, these are some misguided notions of what it looks like. So I think the will is there, but I think there's no understanding of what we're supposed to be, of what it's supposed to look like.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to dismiss what may be underlying your question. I think there is, in some sense, a general apathy. And there is a sense that the government is supposed to cure a lot of our woes.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that's necessarily the case. The government is there to facilitate a lot, but I don't think they're never going to be in a position to solve everything.
Yeah, absolutely. So he talks about. freedom as a matter of the will, first of all. And secondly, he says freedom is a matter of responsibility. In other words, you and I, if we're to live in a free society, we have a responsibility um, that we have to execute in order to live free. What comes to your mind when you think of us being responsible in the current milieu that we find ourselves in? Responsible citizens, I guess, who can upkeep freedom.
Rephrase that question again. I'm not sure. I mean,
what comes to your mind when you think of us? Let me rephrase it. How can we be responsible in order to keep freedom up in the U.S. specifically?
Yeah, okay, because I guess mentally I was anticipating the next question as well, because he talked about a matter of responsibility and this matter of a commitment to the responsibility. I think most people, most responsible citizens, depending on where they fall out on the political spectrum, feel a responsibility. To me, the question is whether or not they're the commitment to that responsibility. Now, what that responsibility looks like, I think is where we would debate. And your traditional conservative versus your traditional liberal are going to differ greatly on what those responsibilities look like. And the role of the government in that. So I think in general, a sense of responsibility is there, but commitment to it and the shape of it is where we're going to differ. But there is a large, again, it goes back to the apathetic part. I think there is a large contingent of citizens in the United States are just kind of content. And we used to say in the Marine Corps, they keep up and shut up and they don't really contribute, nor do they really detract. They won't necessarily criticize, but they won't build up. They just kind of, the G.K. Chesterton analogy of the dead fish kind of going along with the flow.
I mean, I think of even a thing as simple as, being responsible in voting. There are a lot of people who, have their views on if you don't have a candidate on the slate who you can't support, then you just don't vote. I mean, it's a small thing as far as responsibility goes. But yeah, I want to go to the third thing that you already alluded to, that it's not only a matter of responsibility, but Oz says it's also a matter of commitment to that responsibility. I think in our culture, and I want you to weigh in on this, I think in our culture, commitment in general is seeing some hard times. I mean, the things that we're committed to, we've lost, I guess, a sense of what it really means to be committed, because we don't have an underlying purpose as far as what we ought to be committed to. There's that drive chain, if you will, is either missing or cut or broken or whatever.
Yeah, I think you're right. And those who think they're committed are often not as committed as they think. I mean, marriage is a good example. We say these vows and then it's only till it's convenient. But we're committed to a cause, but the cause only lasts as long as the news cycle, and then we're on to the next one. I think we are in a unique time right now because so much has stopped and slowed down with the lockdown that it has afforded us a little more time to focus on what's actually happened in the case of the George Floyd incident. But if this was business as usual, I mean, this may be a bit cynical, but I feel like the George Floyd incident would have gotten some attention. It probably would have had some of the protest demonstrations, riots, but we may have moved on, because sadly, it's not the first time that someone like that has died in the hands of in the hands of police custody. And there have been ire raised before. It's not even the first time the "I can't breathe" occurred. Think one thinks of Eric Garner. So
yes,
our commitment tends to be more flash in the pan. There are people behind these movements that stick with it, and then they're frustrated because it gets national public attention till we move on to the next crisis.
Right.
Politicians play that. When they get in trouble, they wait for the news cycle to play out. So I think you're right. Our commitment is they're bullet points. They're little tickers on the bottom of a screen, and then they're gone.
Very interesting. Just to remind you, if you're listening in, we're talking about that we're delineating a framework for what freedom is. We've talked so far about a matter of the will, freedom being a matter of the will, freedom being a matter of responsibility, and then freedom being commitment to that responsibility. And then this fourth one, KJ, is something that I really really caught my attention, that freedom is a matter of power, yes, but then he says freedom is a matter of power that's based on truth. And in this postmodern milieu that we live in, or beyond postmodern milieu that we live in, we know that power, hunger for power, grabbing power, is one of the viruses that really has infected our times, and we see that playing out right now, don't we, on the national stage?
Yeah, we do. And Oz has got some other lines where he's talking about without these truths and whatnot, that it just becomes might, and
Mm,
that's something that's dangerous. We don't want people in charge simply because they're the strong. We
mm,
want the virtuous. We want the right people. Yeah, truth has. We live in an age where you can have your truth, I can have my truth,
mm,
and truth is questioned. It's just a very slippery slope, and um, there seems to be a loss of the if we want to use the more relativistic idea, we're
mm.
losing some truths of the founding fathers.
Yes.
We've lost sight of what they were, and even now, truth is so questioned that I can pick up this book here by Os Guinness, read it, and
Mm,
whatever I read and interpret is the truth. I'm
mm,
determined, and I'm the determiner
mm.
of what the meaning is here.
Yes.
So
Mm,
it is, where does it stop? And so now I read the Declaration of Independence, I read the Bill of Rights,
mm,
uh, I read the Constitution,
mm.
and I interpret what they mean,
Yeah.
and it may be very different from what you are. And so I
Right.
know there's often, there's an argument even in constitutional circles of whether it's a living, breathing document or a static document and that kind
Mm.
of stuff. It's hard to arrive on a centered, national identity if we are continuing to shift we're standing as shifting sands.
Yeah, we've lost that absolute index that would otherwise guide us, that we could all agree on. We could come to a consensus on what freedom means, on what truth is. That absolute index seems to be it's probably there, but it's really invisible at this point, and so people aren't seeing it. People aren't agreeing on it, and so if you can't agree on truth, how can you truly be free, in that sense of the word? But then he says that the fifth thing that he says, that it's, and this is where I really want you to comment on. He says that freedom is a matter of options. He agrees that it's a matter of options, but options that ultimately lead to life. You look at the Declaration of Independence, and it talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It starts off with life. So he's saying that you have to have these options that are going to lead people to lead a life um, that is abundant.
Yeah, this is a little bit where you have the advantage. This is one Guinness book I haven't read yet, but it makes perfect sense and it lines up with all of his thinking, because um, what good is freedom if it is not going to afford me those options?
Mm,
And you can claim, and I think this is probably where a lot of class warfare starts to come in. And if you do not have certain options, if there are constraints on your ability to become upwardly mobile,
mm,
uh, not just what we're seeing today in regards to the arguments about systemic racism and whatnot, but you can
mm,
read something like the Hillbilly Elegy and the movement as to why Donald Trump was elected and the things that were overlooked and people that were missing. So there's a lot you can make a claim in all of these where people will talk about, hey, we don't have these freedoms
mm-hmm,
that lead to life, and
mm,
there's got to be something to those claims.
mm.
There's got to be something behind there that ought to make us pause and think. So absolutely, you can say you have freedom, but there might be more inconsequential freedoms, and they should lead to life. And I think one thing as believers is we want to see it lead to flourishing.
Yes, flourishing life. And the sixth thing that he talks about is that freedom is not an end in itself. And this is a good reminder. You talk about freedom, 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 and then you wonder if freedom is an end or is a goal. But he says it's not an end in itself, but it's a means to a goal. And I think the goal that he's talking about there is, of course, um, life itself, life lived in all of its fullness.
Yeah, freedom can't be an end, because to what end does it mean to be free? And you've got those examples of um, certain people can be set quote unquote free,
Mm.
and what you're really doing is harming them. I mean, there's the silly example, I can't remember who it was, but in a TED talk, he was talking about freedom and said, he talked about the fish in a fishbowl and said, you know, you could look at this guy and say, he's locked up in this little fish tank, let's set him free. But if you break the glass, actually that's detrimental to him.
Mm.
So freedom can't be an end. It's got to be a means to something, which is why in the United States, it's a means to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And
Yes.
of course, we want to say that's not even the end. That
Mm.
is maybe the fruit of our freedom.
Yeah.
But yeah, it can't simply be an end in and of itself, because to what end?
Yeah, absolutely. And lastly, he says that freedom takes into consideration not just individual preferences. And, you know, by the way, in all of these points, I'm just paraphrasing. I'm not quoting him verbatim from his book, but it takes into consideration not just individual preferences, but also the whole community. And this is so important. This is so important because what you think freedom is may actually be imprisonment for me. So how do you strike the balance?
Yeah, it kind of harkens back to what I was saying before too, about being so individualistic in our view of things, and that's something
Mm.
here in the West. Since the Enlightenment, we have drifted more and more to an individualistic interpretation of everything.
Mm.
Whereas I know outside the West, there is more, consideration for how this will reflect upon the family,
Mm.
or I think of even just, I lived in Japan for so long, how this will reflect on the business I work for.
Mm.
It's more than just the individual. You can err on the extreme of either. But this reminds me of, and if you bear with me, this one quote from Oz in his book,
Please.
Free People from Suicide, from a few years ago. I
Mm.
love this line. He says, "Unfettered freedom
Mm.
could prove to be the Achilles heel of the modern world,
Mm.
dissipating the license, triviality, corruption, and a grand understanding of all authority, a grand undermining of all authority." And
Yes.
so that, to me, is what that leads into. If we're just so if it's all just individual preferences
Yeah.
over time, whose preference takes precedence.
Mm-hmm.
You and I are both well familiar with Ravi.
Mm.
The old, in some cultures they love their neighbor, in some cultures they eat them. You
Yeah.
have a preference.
Yes. Yes.
So whose preference trumps whose?
Yes.
There's got to be a collective in which, and it's not enough just to say as long as you're not harming your neighbor, because
Mm.
how do you define harm?
Right. How do you define neighbor for that matter?
Yeah.
So many things here. And I just like to leave this with you again. What freedom is? It's a wonderful framework here. A matter of the will, a matter of responsibility, a matter of commitment to that responsibility, a matter of power, but power that's based on truth, a matter of options that lead to life, not an end in itself, but a means to a goal. And lastly, that takes into consideration not just individual preferences, but the whole community. I think that's a great framework. And very interestingly, KJ, I think you and I would agree, as we move toward the conclusion of this podcast. The United States as a nation was never a Christian nation, as some would like to say, but we know that it was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. I think we could agree on that, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that we can dwell and argue on that. Some people take exception, but I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, founded on Judeo-Christian principles, or another way of saying it is that it has Judeo-Christian foundations. Even, in other words, it wouldn't exist without the Judeo-Christian foundations that it's been built on. That being said, KJ, where does God fit into the picture? Because the picture is so crowded right now with so many different viewpoints. Where does God fit into the picture? What does God have to do with freedom in general? And specifically, what does God have to do with freedom in the United States? Because I look at a dollar bill and it still reads at the top, "In God we trust."
Yeah. You're not going to get these notions of freedom and equality and, all men are created equal without some transcendent behind it. I love this quote from G.K. Chesterton. He says, The Declaration of Independence dogmatically bases all rights on the fact that God created all men equal.
Mm.
And it is right, for if they were not created equal, they were certainly evolved unequal.
Mm.
There is no basis for democracy except in the dogma about the divine origin of man.
Mm.
And so he fits in because it's behind that. And, if you want to be a modern secularist and try to wash that away and say that doesn't matter, it absolutely does matter, because you're living on borrowed theology and borrowed morality in that case, because and not every founding father was we couldn't equate him to what a modern day evangelical might be. Certainly there were deists and things like that, and sometimes we romanticize just how Judeo-Christian some of these guys were.
Yes,
but
yes, we do.
These principles were there.
Mm. Mm.
Even if it's they were leaning on them in a pragmatic sense.
Mm.
You might think of someone like Benjamin Franklin, who still confounds me as to where he was at times, because he said something incredibly religious and then not so. But
yeah,
and maybe it was more of a pragmatic use, because he knew that was a way to create. He knew his history. Either way, those principles were there. That's what it's founded on, and I don't think you can pull that thread. It's more of a linchpin than it is a thread, because then I think the heart starts to crumble.
Absolutely. And I think of the words of the Lord Jesus Christ, that, he was in the context there of John chapter 8, how he said to the Pharisees, they thought they were free, they thought they were born free. And he says to them very dogmatically, absolutely, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free, referring to himself, and how Jesus coming into a person's life sets them free, first of all from sin, and then from themselves. And how has the Lord, how has Jesus done that for you? If you'd be so kind as to let us in on that.
Well, I mean, let's remember what he said right before that too. He said, "If you abide in me, then you are my disciples. You will know the truth, and the truth." So it was a conditional statement.
Yes.
And we tend to forget that. And it's actually been popularized by a lot of secular folks. You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Well, there's a little bit more to it. How is it that you know the truth? Well, by being his disciples. How are you disciples? By abiding in him. And that, to answer your question, is, I alluded at the very beginning that I participated in the C.S. Lewis Institute's one-year discipleship program. That, for me, is when I felt like everything started to make sense in the Christian life. And what I think I finally started to begin to understand what it meant to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, and not just this cultural Christian who engaged in culture wars, who followed a certain political platform or certain even just good acts. But that it foundational to who I was in Christ. And so we talk about union or freedom. This idea of Christ is at the root of it, because it helps determine the constraints. I mean, that fishbowl analogy, the fish was free, but he had to have constraints to his freedom.
Right.
And they're boundaries. It's a definition creates boundaries. So when we think of constraints and boundaries, they sound bad, but that's what a definition is. When you're in Christ, it defines who you are.
Yes.
It helps you become more human in that sense. And then you have freedom to live as you were created. And so I think that is, it would have made no sense, I think, at the beginning to put it that way. But now that we've kind of teased this out, freedom is to be and operate and act as you were created to be. It makes no sense to take a fish and put him in the forest, or take a raccoon and throw them out, in the middle of the ocean.
Right.
Sure, they're free, but they're not going to thrive. And so that same principle applies, that we can live out in, whatever context and situation that we're placed in and we're called to be.
Yeah. And it's a wonderful freedom that Christ gives us, isn't it? It's not just freedom, but it's the whole package. You have purpose and meaning in life. And you also have this very important concept that we really need today. And another concept of freedom is unity. That is that we have the ability not only to be united with God, he gives us the gift of being united with himself, but he also gives us the gift of being united with people who hitherto, being in Christ, we didn't have the ability to be united with. He removes this middle wall of partition. And so as you think about the United States, I mean, what a message that is of having freedom, and but also having unity.
Yeah, and it goes to your question about freedom being an end in and of itself. If freedom is an end in and of itself, then freedom will eat itself. That's something Oz talks about quite a bit, is that the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. And he cautions in multiples of his books, but the one I quoted, he talks about, in the end, then it won't be the wolves at the door, but the termites in the floor. That starts to become, I won't say the downfall of America, but what starts to cause us to struggle, implode, turmoil and friction. And that's what we really need to be on guard against. I don't think it's going to be a great enemy jumping over the wall of America and invading. It's going to be us undermining our own freedoms. And, we didn't get too deep into this, but one of the things about freedom is authority. Yeah. And that's what we're all recognizing different authorities. And that's what that one starts to undermine the very authority. And we need to think about under whose authority are we?
Yeah. As I'm sitting here and looking at my computer screen, I'm thinking about the unity that, for example, you and I have. We have clearly, as you can look at the screen, we have different skin color. We have somewhat of an age gap between us. We come from very different backgrounds, both in terms of vocation and in terms of how we grew up. And so all of these differences, yet you and I can sit here and say we're united. We're united in Christ. And the marvel of the American experiment is, I don't think that it would have been possible unless it was founded upon these Judeo-Christian principles that you and I are able to enjoy and live out.
And I think you very definitely demonstrated your freedom within constraints when you said so much of an age gap, when you really clearly meant I'm old and you're young. But well done.
I don't know what I meant. I just said there was.
Well, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah. And we need to guard these freedoms preciously, and we need to expand the conversation. And I what I would wish for, especially with all of the things you're citing, is that folks would listen a little more. There's a little too much grandstanding and a little much too assertion of our rights. And wherever you stand on a political spectrum on some of these issues, there's got to be something behind some of these things on either side of the issues. Listen to the person. And far too often we don't listen to understand. We listen to argue or listen to correct. And I really wish people would come to this point where we can listen to understand one another. And we can still disagree. We're going to disagree. Right. But there's too much talking past each other these days because we're too worried about our rights and our freedoms being violated.
Absolutely.
We're going to love our neighbors. Sometimes we put our neighbors' rights above our own.
Yeah.
Whether it's a mask or it has something to do with the race tensions going on right now, we really need to stop and think on these things.
Yeah. Absolutely. Just before I ask you to sort of put a bottom line on this, and also to pray for America and pray for people's freedoms, I have to mention that this podcast that we're calling Rays of Hope. I have to say thank you to a friend of mine who lives actually in the United States, Claire Vanderhart. She's a nurse, and she was somebody who constantly and consistently kept saying, you need to do a podcast, you need to do a podcast, you need to do a podcast. And as a nurse, she's been on the front lines of obviously the COVID battle. So just wanted to mention her and say thank you to her for goading me on to do this podcast. And this is just our second episode. But if KJ, if you were to put a bottom line on this discussion, if you were to say that there are some freedoms that have been lost and need to be regained, and if there's to be the perpetuation of freedom in America, America's hope of regaining lost freedoms and remaining free is what? Fill in the blank.
Yeah, that would almost be a podcast in and of itself. we're both Christian, and I could give a very Christianized answer. Jesus is the answer. Every third grader in Sunday school knows that. That goes without saying.
Hmm.
But I think if we were to speak to all citizens of the United States, the thing I would want to remind folks is that there is some real genius in these documents. We should refresh ourselves with them. We should remember, as Os Guinness has rightly reminded us, pluralism is built into the fabric and the DNA of this nation, which means if we're going to strengthen our own rights and our own freedoms, we have to support the rights and freedoms of those with whom we even disagree strongly. And that's going to take some very difficult forms. I'm reminded of when Russell Moore spoke once to some pastors who were challenging him, and I forget the exact context, but I think they were trying to oppose the building of a mosque somewhere. And he said, you got to be careful with that, because if you do that, then when they try to build a Baptist church in San Francisco, on the same grounds that we're shutting down the building of a mosque, they'll shut down the building of a Baptist church. That's an extreme example, but we have to make sure we're supporting, whether they're religious rights or otherwise, we have to support the rights of all people. Otherwise they'll come back to bite us. So we live in a pluralistic nation. That's by its design. Yes, it was predominantly Christian at one point. It is not as Christian as it used to be in demographics. So that would be one I'd want to say is remember that, lest we, to use a Lewisian phrase, lest we cut off the branch that we're sitting on.
Yes.
Without realizing it. That would be one thing I'd want to say. And then I would speak to at least the Christians in the audiences. We are told the two greatest commandments are love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Let us live and lean into this kingdom view, because we are citizens there first and foremost. And I would challenge you to think, are you an American Christian or are you a Christian American? Which one's the noun and which one is the adjective? And I would say that you are to be an American Christian. American should be the descriptor there. And sometimes, even if it's just in a practical nature, we get those backwards. And so we want to live into the kingdom and see it realized.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you know, I was actually taking notes, and I came up with 3 R's to summarize what you just said.
Perfect.
Refresh our knowledge of the documents, namely the Constitution and the Declaration. Remember our history, whence we came from, and then re-engage in your responsibilities as a citizen of the U.S. and a citizen of the heavenly city. So there you have it, easy to remember.
That's really cool. I like the way you did that.
Well, thank you so much, KJ, for giving us your time and discussing these things. It's so important. And would you be so kind as to close us in a word of prayer, praying for the citizens, for the nation, for the president, and however the Lord leads you?
Absolutely. Let's pray. Father, we come before you today. Here in the United States, it's a day before Independence Day, a day that many will celebrate and some will lament because they don't feel as free as they should in today's 21st century. So I ask that your hand will be on this nation, that you will heal us, that you will bring us to real unity. Of course, we pray for a revival in this land, for the church, to see the church grow into that which you have for it. Let us not be divided unnecessarily by politics and things. We do need to stand on convictions and those things you've given us, but let us as a church unite and see more clearly what you have for us. Of course, we lift up the leaders throughout this nation, from the most local of leaders, whether they're aldermen or councilmen in the various cities and townships, to mayors, to governors, all the way up to the federal government for our senators, our representatives, and the president and those in the administration. We pray that they will rule rightly and justly, that you will surround them with wise and godly counsel so they make good decisions and they're challenged when they don't. I pray for the American citizens who will vote in people who understand this great American experiment, and we'll put people in office that won't do harm or damage to this. I pray that we as a people will grow in our understanding of what these documents actually mean, and that we'll cherish them more and not try to undermine, erode, or even overturn any of them. I thank you for Kenny. I thank you for this podcast and the work he's done. Bless him even now as he's outside the United States. We miss him greatly here. I pray that you will bless him and multiply his efforts there. And I pray that these lockdown restrictions can be lifted safely as soon as possible, that this COVID-19 threat will diminish, and that we'll get a vaccine sooner rather than later, so we can all be rejoined, and then Kenny can come back and visit us here sooner rather than later. And lest we become myopic on the issues of the United States, there are troubles and turmoils all over this world. I think of the persecution, and there's persecution in countries all over. I'd be, if I named a few, I'd miss some, Lord, but you know where they are. I pray for those who are being persecuted, wherever there is violence. Pray for those, right now in my mind, those in Hong Kong with the new restrictions being placed on them. I pray that your hand will be in all of these, and that the church will continue to be the church, whether it is underground or above ground. And we are thankful for the freedom here to pray this clearly and openly. And I pray that we steward these freedoms well. I pray this all in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, and our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you again, KJ. And I hope you have a wonderfully blessed 4th weekend, and the same to our viewers as well.
It's going to be interesting. I think I can only throw some fireworks in the house or something. I'm locked down.
At least in your yard.
Yeah. So, yeah, come back to Chicago soon, Kenny. We miss you.
I'll try my best. Thank you, brother. God bless you.
Take care.